So it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome Theresa Wise back to campus. The Bangs Lectures is a long tradition here. This is the 15th among them, of trying to take industrial leaders with strong Cornell connections and have them talk about how the modern world has been advanced by the technology you study in a classroom setting. And they're really, when I set this up and started trying to rejuvenate it last year, I immediately constructed a short list of people I wanted to bring, and Theresa was at the top of it. And it's taken me, this is my third year of doing this, it's taken me many years to convince her to come.
That's not entirely true. I was convinced right away.
You were convinced by making it work.
Okay.
So I convinced her right away, but getting it to happen has taken some time. And so Theresa did her PhD, so I was on her committee. It was chaired by Les Trotter.
As was.
And so was Lou Valera. And her thesis was on set partitioning models for crew scheduling. She had already been working, by the time of her defense, had already been working with what was then Northwest Airlines. And a lot of the real excitement in sort of thinking about this thesis as being different was that here was real data and a cutting edge algorithmic work that was changing the way Northwest was doing business. And we all know that this was just the starting point of a big trajectory in the airline industry, and Theresa has been at the center of that. She just stepped down, retired from her position of Chief Information Officer and Senior Vice President of Delta Airlines, because of course Delta swallowed Northwest along the way. So it's really going to be a treat to hear about the evolution of operations research in the airline industry the most 25 years.
Yeah, so the most recent 25 years is all that I can really share. So it was about 25 years ago that I was then between first and second year graduate student and had gone back to Minnesota just for the summer. Thus began sort of this part of the career. So it's really great for me and a treat to be back on campus as well. Unbelievably, I think it's been over 20 years since I have been here. And today's visit is special to me for a couple of reasons. First, being here as part of the 50th anniversary celebration of the ORIE department. But second, and David was thinking this is the real reason I came. It's not, but I'm visiting campus with my now 16-year-old daughter, Anna. You can wait. Okay. Who's just starting to think about her own college experience and shares our, I think, probably collective love of math, science, and computer science. So Anna's actually, just a little bit of personal background, Anna's the oldest of two Wise children. Our family started with Jim and I, and those of you who knew me at the time, Jim and I were dating long distance during my years at Cornell, so we were early adopters of email and instant messaging. And our family now includes Anna, who's 16, and Jonathan, who's 13. We live in Minnesota. And on the outskirts, if those of you familiar with the area, the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so I've now spent actually just over 25 years in the airline industry, and the past 15 of those years has been as the CIO of Northwest, and then Northwest was swallowed by Delta, as you so aptly described. Hi, Les Trotter. And it's so good to see you. And so the past 15 of those years as the Senior Vice President and CIO of the airline. And in the prior 10 years, I had spent initially working on building mathematical models. That was what I had started working on when I was here initially as a Center for Applied Math grad student. And then I had led the operations research and industrial engineering groups for Northwest. And then over the past 8 years, as you described, commuting between Minneapolis and Atlanta. So as we go through the talk this afternoon, I will try to give some perspectives on the evolution of OR in the airline industry, particularly at Northwest and Delta, but I'll also try to weave in a little bit about my background and role, and also talk about some, sort of in the spirit of the Bangs lecture, try to talk a little bit about the techniques that we've used to really bring good OR models to life in our industry. And while the most elegant model doesn't always win, it can win. I mean, I think that's what we found through these. It can win if we structure it, implement it, and maybe even most important, communicate about it effectively. So this first is just a little bit about where did it all begin. And so typically when I've been giving talks, I'm talking from the perspective of technology or as a technologist. And so I've used this for a number of IT-focused talks to describe really the explosion of underlying technology enabling the airline industry. And the same is really true for OR, which I added in white at either end. In the 1960s, in the airline, technology itself was largely limited to big mainframe computers that filled a room. And that was also the period where OR was just beginning to be leveraged in a few of the airlines, not Northwest Airlines or its predecessor at the time. Probably more American Airlines was one of the real innovators behind that. And at 55 years or so ago, that was also just prior to the emergence of OR here at Cornell. But through the decades, we've seen this explosion in the use of technology. Computing power literally in the palms of our hands. That's more powerful in many ways than those mainframe computers were at the time. And the use of OR, what we've seen, has similarly exploded. So the operation of airlines, obviously very, very complex logistical problems, it could, with today's scale, it could never be possible, let alone profitable, without OR and OR models. As an industry fun fact, there was a study that Sabre had cited that the world's airlines carry over 3 billion passengers per year and directly employ 8.7 billion people. And so when you think about those airlines or those industries being very tightly interconnected, it's pretty amazing with respect to the logistics and the power and what's there. So a little bit about OR at Delta, just as background. We have about 80,000 employees here, I'm going to be building, we'll just click on it. About 80,000 employees who operate about 15,000 flights a day, 330 destinations, 116 countries. The complexity really magnifies as we start looking at the number of customers or passengers. It's about 170 million per year. And a really important aspect, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the merger of the companies, is the idea of these 11 hubs and what that means from an operations research or complexity perspective. And how those 15,000, and when you think about the network effect of those 15,000 flights and those customers connecting across them, how that really starts to explode over those 11 hubs. And it's what really gives you the power with respect to profitability of the entity, but it also is what requires really good OR to enable it to work. And I kind of believe that one of the aspects of success or failure of the airlines over time, especially if you kind of read some of the research about mergers of airlines, typically don't go well. I think part of the reason that Delta's went well is that focus on OR and what that's meant and how to choose which of these systems to use and how to leverage them over time. So looking back at the 1950s when OR was just starting, the airline industry was really just a novelty for a few elite passengers who were out there. And the OR thinking at the time was about staffing, it was about scheduling, it was even a little bit at that time about trying to predict or forecast demand, trying to figure out where to fly and when to fly. And today's investments do still focus on some of those traditional modeling areas like scheduling and revenue management. The models have gotten better and better. They're still not optimal. They're highly leveraged. So I think advancement will continue as long as there are networks and schedules to optimize out there. But these areas have maybe a little less flair than they did even 10 years ago. Delta, like the broader OR community, is also moving now more into some of the things maybe we were talking about earlier around data analytics, statistical analysis, simulation, machine learning. And we're finding, I think, that nearly every OR discipline, whichever area you're working in, either is or could be leveraged by this complex industry. And making the investment really count depends on, I always think about it as four things. It's around understanding, having you or people like you who really understand the underlying application and its possible formulation. And then it's around applying the mathematics. It's around extracting data, implementing robust solutions, and then communicating and explaining it. And while the fun is sometimes in those first couple of areas, many an innovative solution has died and never seen the light of day in those last two steps, the implementation and the communication. And so it's really having that focus as we look at industry or industries, having that tolerance to work through those pieces as well. So for me, the involvement in the airline industry all began here. With this very innocent-looking set partitioning problem. So as background, I was a little homesick in spring of 1990, so I had accepted a summer internship at Northwest Airlines that took me back to what was then my hometown. I was originally hired to work on the then emerging field of yield and revenue management, but by the time I arrived, that project had been shelved. And unlike other airlines, most notably probably American Airlines at the time, Northwest didn't have an operations research department of its own at the time. So as I oriented myself to the airline and thought, I am not going to spend the summer in a corner doing nothing, I started to meet people around the airline who were working in different disciplines. And I was particularly drawn to these crew schedulers. So their goal, really using whiteboards and markers and what they called rainbow charts, was to consider the set of all scheduled flight legs of the whole airline for a full month, and then assign personnel optimally within this strictly specified set of constraints. At the very least, each of the flight legs out there, a nonstop between a pair of cities in a given month, needed to be covered exactly once with a full complement of pilots and flight attendants. And then each of those flight legs also needed to become a part of a round trip for some set of crew members. Each of those round trips needed to originate at a crew base station, and there were maybe 5 or 6 of those, and needed to return. It could be 1 day, it could be 4 days. And while the duration varied, it did need to conform to a whole bunch of rules that were out there. And among those were maximum flying times, minimum rest times. And as we constructed, or as they were constructing possible round trips to cover these flight legs, they were effectively looking for paths through the system. And there were, think of those 11 hubs or 7 hubs at the time that are out there. There were literally billions of combinations. But not every one of those billion could actually work. Not all of them were legal. And in 1990, these schedulers were doing their work with very limited access to any type of automated tools or really any advanced analytics. And so as I was watching the schedulers do their work, I had enough OR after my first year to see this as a set partitioning problem. And as this search for round trips that were effectively the columns of matrix A, and looking for a set that would exactly partition the legs of the flight schedule. But then, ideally, there was a unique cost associated with them, and some wide variation of the cost, depending on exactly how that trip was built. And so really what they were looking for was the optimal solution to the set partitioning problem. So my dissertation, actually, I went back and looked at it before I came today, and it began with a quote that was from the 1960s that I had described as relevant in its original era and relevant in the early 90s but it's still very much relevant today. And this could be said that the crew scheduling problem, it could be said of so many of these massive logistical problems that are out there in industry. And that's that while the crew scheduling problem has been solved, in quotes, many times using many and varied techniques, it's never been solved completely to the satisfaction of the airlines, and certainly not to the degree of rigor that the term solution would apply to a mathematician. So this was from a 1969 article in Transportation Science. And so working with Les and with David and with Lou, we had proposed and investigated the use of both delayed column generation for matrix A and polyhedral combinatorics as one of the tools to drive towards more optimal solutions to the airline set partitioning problem. So there's now lots of literature out there on this if you're interested. And today's solutions to this same problem are varied, much, much, much better than even what we were able to drive to at the time. But at the time, what we found was, and again, using some of the things that we were working on or learning here, was that the polyhedral structure of the crew scheduling set partitioning problem had not yet been, at that point, fully exploited, although other techniques had been used. But as important, and maybe even more important, there was this common simplifying assumption that was out there and that was used by a lot of people who were publishing things about the crew scheduling problem in the 80s and 90s. And that was that this problem had two more or less distinct phases, that you generated the matrix and then the second was the optimization to solve it. And this was personally my first introduction to the critical importance of formulation and really understanding the nuance behind what is it that we're trying to solve. And is that simplifying assumption useful? Because sometimes they are, right? Sometimes you need to make it to move forward. Or was it something that simplified it for the sake of the academic research, but then rendered it virtually useless in the end? And in this case, that was the situation. But then I think the other thing that I found really cool and have loved ever since is the idea that once you really dug in and understood what mattered behind this, it drove us into other areas of mathematics and research that were actually much more interesting than some of the initial research that was being done. So our approach ultimately used delayed column generation and linear programming duality to define a master LP optimization problem, and a slave problem that generated additional crew patterns for the master to consider. The slave itself, though, became one of the really cool aspects, and I think something that David really helped with as well, which was that there was this bi-criterion shortest search, and that was required based on the intricacies of the cost structure of the crew. And again, until you get in to really understand that underlying application, you don't know that. And that was, so part of what I thought was amazing was this idea of a wealth of data that we could use to analyze and do this. But the other part was really getting in and understanding the nuances of what that problem was and what that potentially presented and what some of the tools we might use to resolve it. So while I spent the next several years working on crew optimization and some of its offshoots, during those years, Northwest Airlines, more broadly, began building what I would describe as a small but mighty operations research team of its own. So the initial areas of focus were fairly traditional, I would say. They were optimization and forecast related. So in addition to the crew planning that I was working on, there were a few really great people who were working in network and scheduling optimization, so starting to bring more mathematical modeling and optimization into what aircraft to put on what routes at what times, given underlying demand and given sort of a rudimentary understanding of customer preference, as well as the operating capability of those aircraft. There was work starting to happen in yield and revenue management, the idea of selling or protecting the right number of seats for the right customer on the right route at the right time at the right price. And then by the time I formally moved from being a student to joining the OR group, and then a couple of years later eventually began leading it, we had branched into some additional areas as well. One of the big ones was forecasting part failures on aircraft with the goal of driving greater airline reliability. And a problem that sort of continues to be one of my ongoing favorites, which is what to do when reality interacts with the optimized plans that are out there. So we very creatively call this irregular operations recovery. And the easiest part of the concept for me to explain, just because I was so deep on the crew side, is crew recovery, but an analogy exists across the whole operation. So kind of recalling that crew set partitioning problem, each flight leg starts out being covered exactly once by a round trip that carries maybe multiple round trips of different members of the crew. And they may or may not, that crew may or may not at any juncture be staying with the same physical aircraft that they were on. And so, I mean, the reason for that, people need rest, airplanes don't. People need to go home at some point. Airplanes can continue up there for maybe even a month at a time as long as they're being maintained. And so what happens when weather or mechanical malfunction disrupts a flight with a cancellation or delay? How do you get that crew back onto its original trip or alternatively back home? How do you cover the flight legs that were broken and all that? Well, so clearly one broken round trip, can't do anything with that, can't solve it, can't get anyone anywhere. But if we smartly break another one or another 10, suddenly you end up with some pieces to play with and potentially optimize and put a schedule back together to get everyone back to where they needed to be and get everything covered. But we really can't willfully break too many of those otherwise good trips on a regular basis, because we then create chaos for the operation and for the crew members. And so they've already carefully planned their work life in advance to make it work. And so this is still a project that's being pretty actively worked, along with solving the holistic operations recovery. So what do you do with planes? How do you get the next plane there? What do you do with the plane that broke? Move that out. What do you do with the customers? How do you handle the maintenance? How do you handle the crews? And there are solutions to this. Obviously, airlines run today, but I would say they're not good solutions. And I think that's an area that really is starting to come back to life from an OR perspective. So personally, after a couple of years of leading the OR group, it was then the mid-90s. And we were starting to, at that point, have some really good, robust models, really good, robust mathematical models. But our effectiveness was limited. And I think a lot of OR groups, a lot of businesses felt this by disconnects among the business professionals, among the OR mathematical modelers, and the IT and data professionals. And so the mid-90s was a particularly important time in the evolution of yield management and revenue management. And so I decided that since I understood it from a business perspective, and I understood it from an OR perspective, I was pretty good at helping to bridge that gap. I also was going to learn it from an IT implementation and data management perspective. So I crossed over at that point. You know, I still had my love of OR and kind of kept a big arm into it, much more so over time. But I, at that point, shifted into a more IT leadership role. And so my favorite story when I share this for various corporate climbers who are out there, I describe, I took a pay cut, I took a title cut, I took all kinds of things for the purpose of saying there's no point in having the world's smartest OR people in this organization. There's just no point if if you can't get to a point where the stuff is implemented and makes a difference. And so that was actually the era where a number of the airlines started cutting or reducing their OR teams, in part because they felt like, well, these are good ideas, but they're not really implementable. And my position is they're implementable. We just don't understand them well enough to implement them. So at that point, I crossed over and was part of the team that was driving one of the earliest true implementations of what we call origin to destination revenue management. And there were a number of research groups working on this at the time. There was a team out of the Flight Transportation Lab at MIT. There was a group at Sabre and elsewhere. And they had really good working models and analytics. But very few, if any, airlines were there. And again, I would surmise that it was based on the same thing that we were experiencing at Northwest in terms of implementation, application complexity, and the understanding across that. So in a moment, we'll take a step back to the OR stuff in general, but I just thought I would, this is my best attempt to put on a single slide in 2 minutes or less, airline revenue management, but it's worth kind of understanding what it is. So airline revenue management is largely based on a differential pricing theory, believing that different market segments, and this is also the cocktail conversation, right? Everyone's like, why are there all those different prices and all that? And so, I mean, it's the assumption that different market segments have a different willingness to pay for air travel, and that different fare products can be offered to different customers, all of whom are competing to buy the same physical seat. So airline being a little bit different than other industries, that it's literally the same physical seat that they're comparing for, but it's effectively a different product. So the theory is that you can generate higher profits with multiple fares than you can with a single fare by generating either higher revenues or higher loads depending on sort of this constantly moving demand cycle on those flights. So this theory then requires segmenting passengers, preventing those who are willing to pay more from buying down. And then because of those segments that you put in place, you're effectively forcing your highest value customers to appear last to buy the product, or you're forcing your lower paying customers to come first. And so then you have the secondary problem, making sure that you have enough seats saved for your highest value customers. So the concepts at some level are pretty simple. We kind of break it into the three, in the gray, the three modeling elements. You have a forecaster that's continuously calculating demand for each of your fare products. You have an overbooking model that's trying to consider, based on the traffic that you're taking, who's going to show up and who's not going to show up. And then you have your optimizer that's trying to balance the yield or the average fare with the load factor to maximize your revenue. And again, because customers arriving to buy essentially the same seat are coming in the reverse order of their value, the idea is that in the lower arrow going across, you are continuously calculating protection levels, we call them, for the higher value customers, which are translated to booking limits on the lower value customers. And there are a number of well-known algorithms out there for something that's called EMSR, expected, did I write that anywhere? Expected marginal seat revenue. And the revenue management systems at the airlines are all a little bit different, and all the airlines consider their own revenue management system to be sort of their secret sauce. But typically they're using these EMSR-based calculations as their base. So there's various versions of that. There's EMSR-A, EMSR-B, EMSR-C. I don't know if there's a D at this point. They're very creative. And basic revenue management is thought to give you 4 to 6% advantage over not using the model, and when you're running that across $10 billion, it's a lot. And then the origin destination revenue management is thought to give you another 1 to 2% value over that. And this is another area where airlines and researchers have explored a number of different optimization methods for the booking limit optimizer part. Some use a more deterministic linear program, some use dynamic programming, some use nested probabilistic network bid price optimization. I mean, a number of airlines have different models. But on average, honestly, those drive very similar revenue gains. The real differentiators is in that part up in white. It's in the historical databases, it's in the accuracy of the forecaster, a lot of which is driven by the data, and it's with respect to their robustness under the realistic conditions. And so that was the reason for my move into that area, is that I believed in the booking limit optimizers, which was, again, that was where the mathematics was. That was and is, I think, the secret sauce. But you couldn't convince anyone of that and to implement it if the other parts around it didn't work. And so, like I said, I spent about a year and a half working on the implementation of that, and then moved to a broader technology role because, kind of similar to that feeling of the OR, the mathematical modeling is amazing, but you need the data to work for any of that to make sense. Then it became the real way to leverage revenue management isn't to just have amazing technology and models around revenue management. You need that on the sales side, and you need that on the accounting side, because those are the pieces that feed in, right? The sort of organism of where's the leverage and how does it work continues to move out, and is a really important piece of it as well. So then a couple of years later, now almost 15 years ago, I moved into the CIO role for then Northwest Airlines. And so it's actually a different lecture topic about having a 2-year-old and realizing you're expecting another baby about a month into taking that executive role, that I'm living proof 15 years later that it can work out. So Northwest was actually one of the smaller airlines, but we started to be able to do some really good things with, and again, it was always described as good things with technology, but I think that's in large part because we built this strong connection. So by the time I was the CIO, then I had the operations research stuff back, and it was that tight connection between OR, IT, and sort of business and understanding how businesses move forward. So we ultimately had or helped develop business leaders in every area, from marketing to finance to operations, who really sought to understand the decision support models. And they always wanted to know why it answered in a certain way. And the power of being able to explain why was that then that inspired them to add, they would say, okay, I get that. Now I want to ask the next question, which then drives that next level of innovation that continues to build on itself. And I'll talk about this a little bit more as we describe, kind of how are things different today and moving today, and where are some of the risks. Is that, some of, I'll just give a preview of it now, that some of the areas such as neural networks, some of the areas, they're a little bit opaque with respect to why the answer is what it is. And so we've actually started developing supplemental models that, predicting, trying to predict on an aircraft which aircraft should be opened up for maintenance, what's the next smartest one, so where are the risks. We were getting better predictive results using some of these other tools, but we couldn't explain it. And then you have your technician saying, I'm not opening the airplane until you can tell me why it needs to be open. And so, and I'm saying, but it's, the prediction's way better. And so we found ourselves developing supplemental models. So we're letting those do their work, but then developing supplemental models that help explain it. Why would we do the investment and do that additional work? Because otherwise, all the smart stuff that we do over here has no value and no interest. So again, it's just keeping in mind that I feel like part of the value of what we do is in being able to explain it And again, that drives the next project, it drives the action, it drives all of those things. So the next adventure was about 7 years into my stint as CIO, so about 8 years ago. Northwest, which is where I was acquired by Delta Airlines. So at the time, there really weren't a lot of good models about successfully integrating technology or operation for major airlines. And a lot of people have a lot of theories about, you're looking at each other, a lot of people have a lot of theories about why that was. So I'll share mine. I think the difference is having OR and IT and having the business really tied into that. And I think that was, people have, the Delta Northwest merger was very successful, and there are lots of people who point to lots of reasons for that. I think that was a very big part of it. It wasn't that I magically did something different in terms of project management, but it was that we had these teams that could really look at and understand the nuances of what you're putting together and why you would choose one system versus another. Why would you choose one model versus another? And probably the easiest way to think about that or describe it is that you had Delta, significantly larger airline, more than double the size of Northwest, more than twice as many flights per day, but they were mostly domestic in the U.S., and they transited a single hub in Atlanta. Then you had Northwest, which was much smaller, but it had 7 major hubs at the time that interconnected throughout the world, close alliance partners that cross-leveraged networks in Europe and Asia. And so if you could remove any personal bias, like, I like this system better than that one, which revenue management system do you pick? Which reservation system do you pick? Which airport operation systems do you pick? What customer service solutions do you pick? And it's actually not as, a lot of people have a lot of pundits or ideas or whatever. I would say, in retrospect, not as obvious as it seems. But I knew that with the OR, the IT, and the business leaders working together, that we sort of had what it would take to solve it. So why did I believe we could all do it? It was because of that IT and OR combination, and none of the others who had tried this had that at their disposal. And so I really believed that with that we could establish what became a blueprint for sort of merger and technology integration. And so the story begins. Again, Delta, I saw it as the passion for results. We had business and communities that we were kind of rallying to serve. As an airline, we were looking at this increasingly global reach of the airline. As an OR and IT team, we needed to build a technology platform that could power it. And at the same time, we had this enormous dependence on these real-time global transactions. So we needed solutions that drove value, that drove the most value. We needed solutions quickly, but we also needed to do it in a way that didn't displace any of the underlying operations. So you were there was a video around at the time that was just perfect. It was like an ad for EDS or something, and it was building an airplane while flying. And I thought, that was exactly how it felt, that we were sort of building this new airline, but we were flying these 2 other ones underneath the surface. And so this is an old slide that I recycled, but I think it's kind of a good one to describe this era. So with the combined airline, we were looking for a platform that could enable 70,000 colleagues in 368 locations, 66 countries, trying to serve 170 million customers per year. They were now trying to fly to 560 destinations with the 2 airlines together, plus resources that came along with putting them together. It now had 10 hubs throughout the world and 80 million SkyMiles members trying to redeem points, and it had 16,000 flights per day. So that was kind of the picture of how it worked. And so then to make it work from a technology and an OR perspective, we were looking at distilling about 1,200 major applications down to 600 as a starting point. And these aren't particularly relevant to this conversation. They're just kind of fun facts. We actually did this. We had 75 projects running at the time, 205 projects, 3,400 milestones. One of the big things, the theory at the time was that you had to cut everything over together. And I said, oh, no. So we ended up breaking it into sort of these 5 major cutover events, 269 implementations. And there were a lot of challenges, like I said, that not the least of which was trying to decide what mix of systems would be the starting state for the new airline, and what that would mean in terms of connectivity and handoffs. And so as we made decisions, we were kind of guided by this common goal of global access and a smooth customer experience. We were trying to find merger synergies. We were trying to move as fast as possible. And so tapping into intellectual capital became a really, really big deal. And yes, there are systems out there to do that. But it was a huge challenge. And so our resolution to this came in the form of something we called a wall walk, which was multiple iterations of a life-size program plan. And the goal was to capture interdependencies among these 75 projects and 3,400 milestones. And it's so low tech that, trust me, I wouldn't have ever shown a picture of it to anyone if it hadn't worked. But it did work. And once I did show it, it actually became sort of part of the pop culture in the airlines as a symbol of the merger. So here it is. So this is it. So we used an entire wall of an auditorium. So the timeline runs across the top, and the sticky notes are handoffs and dependencies among the projects and teams, and that was within OR and within IT. And on the one hand, it was messy, it was corny, it wasn't high tech. On the other hand, it was, and again, as we think about how this stuff works, it was amazingly unifying. And again, I would put that as one of the hallmarks of what makes good OR solutions versus not is ownership and people understanding it and people seeking to understand it. Because you can't use and leverage, I don't think, something that you don't understand. And so tapping into this broad expertise. Also, these systems had been developed over multiple decades. People weren't around anymore. And so really understanding and learning again what all of these things meant. So there were deliberate plans, metrics of success, describing. And I would have initially thought, and in fact I planned, that the system integration was going to be the last thing that I did for Delta. I lived in Minnesota, I was homesick for Minnesota when I was here, didn't end as I grew up. And so my plan actually was, I knew that we knew how to do that integration by really tapping or leveraging across the OR and IT teams. And so my plan was that I was going to do that and then ride off into the sunset, because I didn't, life was in Minnesota and Atlanta was where Delta was. But while that was a remarkable journey and quite a trip, it was really just the beginning. And once you have that starting point, you have this opportunity to be thinking about the next generation of systems. And so actually, Northwest, the little airline, was the one that had the OR group. And again, small but mighty, very active, great people. Delta, the big airline, didn't have that at the time. So suddenly I was looking at, oh my gosh, can we take what we had here, and what does that look when you start to apply it across the bigger challenge. So that was still about 8 or so years ago. And so as we started to structure what the investment in the next generation of solutions would look like, from both an OR and an IT perspective, we focused them around sort of these 5 macro processes of the airlines. And this is still kind of how we're thinking about it and how it's moving forward. So they're shown here. I'll give a little overview of them and then share a few stories within each of them. So in general, we plan and sell the airline. So any modeling, any OR, any IT investments in planning and selling the airline, you're looking for things that are going to be prioritized based on revenue returns. And so we kind of thought, okay, we'll invest about this much, and we'll pick the best projects that drive the best revenue returns. We deliver a premium customer experience. Someone was saying there are lots of airlines in Ithaca, but only one that serves Ithaca. That makes me proud. So the investment there is prioritized around customer satisfaction and net promoter. How likely are you to tell somebody else that you like Delta? We operate the airline, so here we're focused on transparency and efficiency. So we're prioritizing that investment. So all the ideas that are out there in that around either efficiency, cost savings, or operational excellence, and then we enable the airline. So it's sort of everything that is everything else, HR, computers, all that stuff. And so touching on each of those, first with the plan portfolio. So that's going to look at where do we fly, partnered with who throughout the world, with what aircraft, what cost, what price. Heavy decision support. So this is one of those historic areas of OR investment. And where we're investing now, I would say describe it as continued improvement on traditional models. So we still have fleets that need to be optimized. We had optimization models. So in that case, we're using a lot of the models that Northwest Tigers Delta didn't have those. And so how do those work with a bigger airline? Where did the size or the size of the airline cause the complexity to explode? What does that mean? How do we need to change it going forward? Schedule optimization. Again, a lot of the traditional techniques, network optimization, simulation are big pieces in that. One of the newer areas, though, compared to even 5 years ago, is this explosion of cheaper storage. And so if you're now able to build and collect larger, more complete data sets, what does that mean with respect to what you're able to solve? And to what extent does it take you down a more important path versus taking you off into the weeds? And how much time do you spend going off into the weeds, and what other questions does that generate? The cell process is the next one. So historically, this was yield and revenue management models that we were discussing. So this is where, at the beginning I was saying the most elegant model doesn't always win, but sometimes it can win with the right communication. So obviously I have a lot of passion around the origin destination revenue management stuff that Northwest Airlines had built, and I felt very strongly that it was sort of the thing that was out there. How do you sell that to people who have never looked at that? And I have people saying, I know it's the Ferrari, but I don't have people who know how to drive Ferraris. I have people who know how to drive Model T Fords. I just want to keep that. And so, how do you build that, and how do you sort of teach people to use the models and really leverage them? One of the other things that we found when I was saying, the part of the magic is in choosing the solutions and choosing the technology that comes out of the merger. So we talked about red systems, blue systems, and purple systems. And so a red system came from, I don't even remember anymore, probably Northwest, and blue came from Delta, and then purple was something that was newly developed. And I was like way against purple because, we just needed to start someplace and move forward. And we went purple in our tech ops maintenance, and it took years. Got it done though. But I also took a position that said it's not one size fits all. We're not going all blue or all red. It just doesn't make sense. Where we wanted the blue systems were in areas where there were huge user bases to train. So airport systems, reservation systems were a really good example. And you could have argued that System A was better than System B. But what you really wanted to do as a starting point was go to the thing that was familiar to the most people. And then where I tried to use some of the other something is looking at something like revenue management, or crew optimization. You've got to go with the best and most sophisticated. And people would say, oh, but we've already got one that works for the big airline. And then explaining to people, it's when it comes to revenue management, it's not the big airline, because you're going origin to destination and you're looking at paths, and there are way more paths with the little airline because of all the hubs. And now you look at all those hubs against the big airline, and there's no way that the model that worked with one hub was ever going to work. And so you think about the sort of, again, the value of people with OR backgrounds in every role in a company is so important to sort of help and move that forward. So in this cell area is where we, again, the traditional yield and revenue management models, but it's also one of the areas that's a really interesting one right now. And again, it sounds so old and old school, is flight search optimization. So when you go, whether it's Expedia or Delta.com or wherever you go, and you're looking for a flight from point A to point B, its speed, its accuracy, its completeness, its reliability. And Delta leases a solution actually from ITA, which is now Google. Alternatives would be healthy. They don't exist. I think they would take years to develop. It's actually an area where, prior to leaving, we were looking at, is there some type of partnership with some various academic groups that could make that happen? But then, who pays for it? Because it's years and it's not clear that it ever goes anywhere. But that's an interesting one today, and way more complex than people think. Customer analytics is another area of focus. How do you predict attrition? How do you evaluate the lifetime value of a customer who's maybe 20 years old today? What incentives are out there? What do they generate? What's the response? How do you measure it? How do you measure that response if it's not coming directly to you, but is going through a secondary party? There's big efforts still around forecasting, estimating willingness to pay. Historically, pricing was sort of a matching exercise up until even a couple of years ago. But we're now taking that and saying, what if that's one of the other things, that you're actually able to optimize and drive different decisions? There are opportunities in Delta.com and mobile spaces that are looking at what lies at that computer-human interface, whether it's natural language, understanding stuff we're talking about with respect to image recognition. We talk about text mining, text clustering. How do you look at what's making people happy or unhappy? Some of it is regression type of modeling, but really trying to zero in on what matters from a customer perspective. What are people saying? Does that change what I do as a business or not? The delivering an exceptional customer experience, among other things, is streamlining and simplifying processes. From an OR perspective, this is where we're trying to increasingly use big data, I hate buzzwords, and various analytics to increasingly have more of that 360-degree view of a customer. Again, similar to the cell process, looking at the lifetime value, what actions generate positive response, how do you measure a positive response other than somebody just buying a ticket. Recovering and instantly rebooking customers is another piece. So I was talking about the irregular operations earlier. Actually, much better than our operation of our own people and planes. We've actually gotten quite good at, if you've flown on Delta or watched the news during a snowstorm, we had something that's called Viper. And it actually works pretty well. It'll even move people to seats and such that are similar to where they were. But the challenge with it is that it works very, very well if there are cancellations where you have that sort of full set of information with flights coming in. It's a lot trickier if there's a delay. And then there's also a piece of it that's how can we get better and better at predicting what a customer would want, because you think of that rebooking process and what they originally exactly had isn't there anymore. But how do you predict what they might want so that with some degree of certainty you are placing them and holding space for them in a place that they'll want, because otherwise that space is something that somebody else would want, and how do you put them in the order? So again, a lot that's evolving there that's sort of fun from an OR perspective. And then on a different note, we've had a series of simulations that are used in airport customer service, helping, again, that idea of communication. We found simulations are really good methods of communication with day-to-day operators in an airport that lets them see their day-to-day workflow through a little bit of a different lens. And believe it or not, we do use it for aircraft boarding. And so believe it or not, there is some science behind what we do. I think that one probably, whereas some of the irregular operations recovery stuff, I think is some of my favorite stuff that's going on, because it's just on the cusp of doing some new and cool stuff. I hate aircraft boarding because I think that's one where nobody's probably dug into it quite far enough, and the simulations don't actually simulate what people are going to do. So the simulations would kind of say that random boarding is the best. Well, but the point is that it's not random. The people who randomly go first are the people with a whole bunch of crap who, and they've moved to the front. They're the same people who said, and I want to get on first because I'm sitting in front. The random assumes that they're actually spread out through the plane, and so, but that's a really good example though of making sure that doing that type of thing are really understanding the nuances of what's behind, and if it's not reflecting the net reality, how do you look at it in a different way? From an operations perspective, again, this is that portfolio that looks at the overall efficiency, the transparency of the airline operation. There's crew optimization, continues to be kind of an area. Crew recovery, flight planning, fuel optimization is another one. Aircraft maintenance, aircraft reliability. So kind of a fun look at aircraft maintenance. I was talking to one of my OR colleagues recently who specializes in this area. And this was the example where he had built a predictive analytic model to estimate the probability that the aircraft would suffer a delay. And so he was the one who said, I had this great model, but when I couldn't tell people, so his initial model that he built that was a little less sophisticated did a good job of indicating why the alert was estimated. People loved it and they were using it. And then, as he started working on neural networks and other methods to improve it, while, again, at some level the model got better, the usefulness of it became worse. So again, a good piece of the insight there. But this is another area to operate where we have a lot of OR development continuing to go on. Probably the biggest area within this enable group, again, these are human resources systems, supply chain. Who was I talking to about supply chain earlier in the hallways? So supply chain systems is another one in this area. Probably not quite as sophisticated for an airline as for some other industries. But there's interesting stuff going on in that space. But maybe one of the most interesting ones has been the cobbler's children who have no shoes, which is actually the IT department. So whereas we have lots of effort around enterprise logging and predictive analytics for airplanes, we don't do the same with our data center operations yet. Those too can drive flight delays and issues and problems. And so increasingly looking at how do we leverage some of that across IT, and again looking at that as sort of similar to me with the airline data when I was working on my dissertation. It's an area where we can put in whatever, we don't have to ask anyone's permission to put in the monitoring and logging, and might there be some cool new things we can learn from that perspective as well. So again, hate buzzwords, but here they are in case you like them. Big data, social connectedness. We could probably throw machine learning in there as well. Any other buzzwords you like? So airlines have historically been big data users, what was big back in the day. But there is a lot of effort around this idea of social connectedness. What can we learn from it? What matters? The analogy that we use for ourselves in this is a big national retailer that feels like a corner hardware store. And that's kind of, that's one of those models that's out there. And looking at that like through the lens of another industry, what does that mean in the airline industry? How could we use it? I would say that we're probably, the whole airline industry is probably behind the curve with some of these things. We would tend to feel that we still have so much that we can gain from just good old-fashioned like descriptive analytics that we haven't even gotten to the point of fully leveraging that yet. But I think something that we have our eye on. Here, I don't know whether this is interesting or not, but they're just fun facts. They're a few months old, so they've probably changed a little bit since then. I don't know if these are bigger or smaller than you would expect, but across all the platforms, Delta stores about 2 petabytes of data. We use about 200 terabytes for purely analytic purposes. The others tend to be more transaction-oriented. We see, though, and this one I think is more of the fun fact, and this I was using to justify buying stuff, but the annual growth rate of the analytic data is about 40% per year. And the reason for that are the number of queries that are out there and the number of users. So if you look across all of the employees of Delta, about 1 in 15, and so you think of it, I mean, you have baggage handlers, you have people in the airports, but more and more as you teach people about the data and what is out there, you have more and more people who have an interest and want to use it. And again, I've always kind of been a proponent of having that out there, at least as an option, right? At a minimum, with the screen I have, there is a way to look at that. And that is how the next leaders of the operations organizations evolve, are the people who see that and want to tap into it. And then very conservatively, as we've looked at the step up, we think, probably the analytics itself is probably conservatively worth about $300 million a year. So again, I would just say from my perspective, when you look at what maybe one of the most invaluable forces for change is within the airline industry, at least for Delta, I believe it is that combination of OR and IT. It's very much alive and healthy, well after its 50 years. And again, I think it is what allowed Delta to build its blueprint around the merger and acquisition. So I think Delta has you all to thank for that. And again, on a personal note, especially particularly thanks to a number of you who helped. So that is what I had to say, 3 minutes over plan.
Great. Thank you very much. We still have time for questions.
So after the acquisition was approved, was the integration of flight operations between the two airlines staged, or was there full integration at some moment later? And if so, how long?
Yeah, so So first, there's all of these regulatory approvals to make sure, I don't know, that things are legal and you're not creating something that is anti-competitive. I think the whole project was on the order of about 18 to 24 months. So it was fast in airline time, and a lot of it, in a lot of areas, nothing could have been done sooner. So what we did from the moment, so there was sort of the plan of it, and then there was the official approval of it. So then within 3 months of official approval, we really were doing, it was that second one down around that goal of global access, smooth customer journey as fast as possible. And so initially what we did was the merger of the SkyMiles. So, okay, part of my logic too was get the stuff done that will get people to just sort of back off. And so one of them was once people could redeem their miles across everything in a combined way, customers were sort of happy for a period of time. Then once you could check in on everything, so we built a lot of things multiple times. So we built a lot of cross-connecting of systems so that customers could check in. So again, that would then relieve the pressure of driving that. And then with the cutovers itself, we cut over. We got to the point of being able to cut over to a combined sales or reservation system faster than the airline, through the government regulation, was able to get to the point of having a single operating certificate. So we, while still behind the scenes doing accounting separately, we cut over to sort of all common customer systems and reservations, but still had two operations in the background. And then it was midnight one New Year's Eve where we had the operating system. And so then immediately we cut over the operations because there was so much value and simplicity of doing that. So for the most part, we kept the technology moving as fast as the regulatory approval was happening, but we did that by actually sort of over-investing and crossing, if that makes sense, kind of crossing the systems over to each other. The one that was the long pull that literally took, I want to say, like 3 or 4 years was, and it was a big problem to begin with, but looking at the maintenance data and records and history of both airlines. Every airline has sort of its own way of doing it and its own fields and its own explanations of those fields. And that was the one area where I did cave, and people had this great idea of a new system to have in that area. So that was the one that we went to purple. Bad idea, if anyone wants to know. And so that took significantly longer. And again, in retrospect, it might have anyway, just because of the complexity of putting it together. And also because in that situation, right was so much more important than fast. There was no actual value to fast there other than it needed to get done and we needed to continue to show progress. So that one lagged significantly. But again, I think one of the reasons it all went so fast is that we found ways to decouple it and break it apart and move things in as quickly as we could.
Theresa, I had a question about the $300 million that you had in terms of value of analytics. And I just wonder, I remember vividly these statements about when you were doing crew scheduling about the fact that crew costs were second only to purchase costs.
Okay, yeah, okay. So that's the analytics in this case is just the tiny subset. It's literally just the pure an analyst having access to data and information, as opposed to all of the modeling and systems that are there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering about the relative value to the industry of what of revenue management, which of course is newer, than operations management, which was crew scheduling and so forth. And have there been studies done that show It's a two-part
Yeah.
question. Have there
No.
been studies done to show the value? And secondly, you said you made a personal commitment to go from operations management to revenue management. And I wonder whether it was just the excitement of a new area, or whether it was actually something that you could see there's something going on here that's revenue driven that we need to work on.
So, so I'm sure there are studies. I can't cite them, but I will say that airline leaders tend not to believe them. So, as I would, and the reason for it is this, that the actual dollars that you can show that you save for something like crew scheduling, operations scheduling, the optimization pull costs out of the business, they're real costs. And they go away. I mean, those costs go away. You get the way the model works is, you kind of say it'll cost me this much to do it, and I can get this much value. And then, at the end of the project, that value gets taken out of your budget and, taken back, right? So it is real cost. And if I'm a financial manager in the airline, I love those projects. They're straightforward. They're hard work, but they're easy to understand, and I physically see the result. So financial managers in an airline love the operations projects. The revenue optimization ones typically are any given project for the amount of dollars I'm going to spend. The leverage is 5, 10, 20, even 100 times those operations ones. But if I'm the financial manager, they're huge. But if I'm the financial manager, I say, it's revenue. I think, prove to me that you wouldn't have had, the world is becoming richer. There's more revenue coming in. I don't believe it. Okay, so then I'm looking at it in one of, I can't remember if I put, I talked about it. Yeah, I'm just so trained I didn't even put it in the slide. That idea of it's 4 to 6%. I mean, that's 4 to 6% of $10 billion. I mean,
you mentioned that.
Yeah, they're huge numbers. And I believe them. And so then when we were looking, and then that idea of 1 to 2% going to the origin destination revenue management, I fundamentally believe those numbers. I'm positive they're right. And so that was the really interesting part, was that Delta used more of a, because they didn't have an OR group when the merger happened, Delta purchased a revenue management system from somebody who sold revenue management systems. I mean, and it was very generic, and it was what sort of little airlines used. I think it worked because, although it was a big airline, its structure was so simple with one hub. So I think it actually worked, and I don't think that was a bad decision. But when you would have looked at trying to use that across all the hubs and the whole thing, there's just no way. And so I was pitching hard the idea of going to sort of real revenue management, and there was a cost to doing it, and people were afraid of the complexity. And so I did, MIT had Peter Baldata in the flight transportation lab there. And so we had Peter as an independent third party, kind of trying, from a university, we tried a lot of things to sort of put together those studies. I had friends at Bain. I'm like, I need you to do a study. And so again, people would do the studies. It was really, 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 really hard to convince people of that, until I could sort of get to the point where I would say, the price is almost the same to do both. Just take a risk, try it. I was sort of to that point. So I think the revenue stuff is significantly more highly managed. It's just harder for a business to measure it in retrospect. And so even that $300 million, that's just giving people data and information to use. And I think that was a number that my team had used to pitch something. And again, I think they wanted like $3 million to spend on some new stuff. And they're saying, come on, it's like I mean, we could point to that much, but there's so much more that's out there. That was why that was saying it was conservative. So I think, again, particularly on that revenue management front, it's really highly leveraged. I think the challenge in that, though, is the idea that you're not today, like I can't make a case to say that, you know, sort of this method of optimization versus that method of optimization. You know, when you think about that chart that had the little the optimizer piece on it, I think at some point what optimizer it is going to matter, but right now where you get the leverage is just by having clean data applications coming into it. But yeah, I think I think it's hugely leveraged. It's just harder. It's harder to measure.
So I think we're gonna have refreshments next door, so you can ask questions one-on-one. First of all, I didn't say up front, but I should have said that this is, of course, the kickoff event for our 50th anniversary. The technical program, if you haven't seen it, is up on the flat screen in front. There are a long day of talks tomorrow, a range of panels and speakers, and I highly encourage you to take advantage of the wealth of talent that we have. But I hope you all will join me next door for reception, and let's thank Theresa for just a minute.